Welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinscoe. I'm an advisor, author, and general explorer of the service and experience space. My guests tend to have just released some interesting research. They run a company that has some interesting tech in the service and experience space. They are part of an organization that is doing some cool stuff, or they run their own business doing interesting things for both their customers and or their employees. That's enough from me. Let's get into the interview. Before we get into the podcast, I want to give a big shout out and thanks to the folks at Text Expander for sponsoring this episode of my podcast. Text Expander is an autocomplete tool that allows your team to eliminate repetitive typing and stay on the same page with just a few keystrokes, allowing you to delight more customers in less time. Check out the link in the show notes to find out more and to get a 20% discount for the first 12 months of Text Expander if you use the code SWINSCOE. Now, let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have Richard Hammond, who is the co-founder and CEO of Uncrowd. Some people may recognize Richard's name for if you're a long-time subscriber to the podcast. Well, if you are, then welcome and thank you so much. But Richard, hello, welcome back. How are you doing?
Hi, Adrian. Yeah, doing really well. And you're going to tell me that last podcast was like 3 years ago, aren't you?
Yeah, I know. And
feels like yesterday.
We'll get into that. But actually, for the people that are first time hearing your about your name and also Uncrowd and stuff, can you give us a bit of a thumbnail sketch on you and also the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a retailer through and through. Been a retailer for 37 years now, and it's kind of my heart, my love. 20 years ago, I started writing about retail, trying to make sense of the world that we operate in, published a book called Smart Retail. That's now in 4 editions, 22 languages. Lovely. My mum loves me to say that. She's proud of that. But,
proper job.
Yeah. But it's really about what makes great retail. And for the last version of that, one of the things we talked about was trying to find a metric to measure what great customer experience actually was, and to try and work out how, from your experience and quality, you could work out how you sit versus somebody else's. It was a purely academic exercise for a book, and before I knew it, various people were coming to me saying, "This looks like customer analytics. This should be a platform. This should be a metric." And now it is. 4 years later, we have Uncrowd, and we are essentially the only customer analytics tool that's able to not only give you a measure with causality of satisfaction, but also to show you exactly the same data across your rivals. And that becomes really critical because it's not just a case of how tall you are. You know where you sit on a continuum, whether other people are taller, other people are shorter, what that means, what that means for your health and wealth.
Awesome. I mean, yeah, as you said, we spoke on the podcast. I checked it just over 3 years ago, and we were talking about that new book, sort of the friction reward, and it was a conversation with, I think it was with yourself and Rocky, your co-founder. Hi, Rocky, if you're listening into this, which you should be. If not, then you. Oh,
he's terribly offended not to have been asked back again, Adrian. He's sat in the corner. He's in a huff.
Oh no! Oh, crumbs.
No, sod him, Adrian.
Okay, well, I'll have to do something else. I'll send him some.
We've all moved on.
I'll send him some beer or something. Anyway, but the kind of like, so, you quickly talked about kind of like the, what's happened kind of since then. Now, but that was friction reward, and you built this platform in order to help people kind of do things. I love the idea that you pointed to causality. Brilliant, because correlation doesn't pay the bills. Causation, that certainly does. Yeah. But it sounds like that your thinking has evolved over the last kind of like few years, and now you're talking about this thing called this relative attractiveness metric. And I was a bit like, oh, that sounds fancy. Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to ask you on the podcast. So one, just to catch up. One, because just to catch up. 2, because I think what you're doing is cool and it's out there, and it's like when everybody's zagging, you're zigging. and particularly around the friction reward stuff. But then you've now got this relative attractiveness, which I think is this evolution of it. So can you tell me about that? Tell me about what the relative attractiveness metric kind of is and how it works.
Yeah, so I mean, the interesting thing, I suppose, or at least it is to me because I'm a data nerd, is that we haven't really moved very far away from the original principles, and that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. What we've done is if anything, we've backfilled some of the hypotheses around that original position with experience and facts.
Right.
And the gratifying thing is seeing that turns out we were right. And, when you mentioned just then zigging and zagging, one of the things that we've learned in the last 4 years of startup life is that most startups are about being right about something for a long time that everybody else tells you is wrong. And that's where we've been. Is we've been pushing against the orthodoxy of contextless tools like CSAT and NPS and voice of the customer and feedback-based analytics. But at its heart is still this idea that essentially almost all human decision-making is a largely unconscious, although people like Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky hate the idea of calling it unconscious. It's not unconscious; it's part of consciousness, but it's not necessarily at the front of thought. Everything is a combination of, frankly, what is the arseache that I have to go through to do X versus what do I get back from doing so. Most life is a series of answers to that question. And why should customer experience be any different was the original hypothesis. And so we did two things. We took that idea of Kahneman and Tversky and we overlaid on top of that a set of behavioral economics, essentially, to say that in any given experience, if you can measure the amount of, I call it arseache, but we call that friction because you can't stick arseache on a poster, particularly not a US trade shows. I don't like it.
Why not?
We're at NRF in New York next week, and so we have to remember how to talk American again.
Oh yeah, because that would be arse. They wouldn't get it.
Yeah,
it'd be arseache.
Yeah, although you can't say it. Yes, cussing. Street words not allowed.
Yes, indeed.
But yeah, it is that combination of what is the effort that you have to go through versus the reward you get back. And what we realised, and I'll get to where relative attractiveness fits in this in a second, but what we realised is really straightforward, is that you can objectively observe any experience and break down those observations into things that the customer has to go through and things that the customer gets back having gone through them. So, the things you go through, of course, obvious things like queuing and wait times, but also search, wayfinding. Those are things you have to get through. The layout logic in a space, that's something you have to get through. Do I trust this retailer? That's a friction. And there's a great example there of, I don't think many of us would say we trust Ryanair. Our friction is very high in that respect. However, the reward we get back is not just cheap flights. The reward we get back is also places to go that I'd never thought of going before. It's curation, it's discovery. It's finding out that actually I can go abroad for my holiday, or it's finding out that I can, commute from Europe, one part of Europe to another part of Europe. I nearly said from Europe to the UK, and that makes it sound like I'm a Brexiter. I'm very much the opposite. We're all Europe, for God's sake. But it's an enablement. That's part of the reward that you get from having overcome the friction of not trusting Ryanair in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I remember kind of like years ago, I spoke to short story. I wrote a piece in my Forbes column that asked the question, does Michael O'Leary of Ryanair really care about his customers, or is he just being pragmatic?
Yeah.
Here's what happened. He wrote me a letter in reply. He literally wrote me a letter, and it was written out, signed by him. They scanned it, PDF'd it, and sent it by email. I was like, awesome. Going, legend. And then I was like, wrote him back and said, thanks very much for clarifying that. By the way, I'd love to talk to you about that. Would you like to come on my podcast? So he came on the podcast.
Brilliant.
And it was brilliant because he's like really kind of like, and I asked him, did you have a road to Damascus kind of moment? He was like, no. He says, I wish I'd learned these kind of things a little bit earlier. I was being a bit hardcore. And he says, but here's the thing I do know. And this is the thing that's the heart of Ryanair's kind of business model, apart from the low cost operation sort of thing. He says the attractiveness for their customers is that in the airline industry, travel industry, he says that for us, 99% of the decision comes down to price. And our strategy is being the lowest cost provider in every market that we're in. If we can't do that, then we exit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And
that was it. That was his thing. He's just like, and we get that right, and we keep getting that right, and then things take care of themselves.
Yeah, that relentless drive is really interesting. And I think what's been interesting for Ryanair is the friction side of that decision making has increased. They had, a couple of years of catastrophic numbers of cancellations, hundreds of thousands, and I think there's a threshold. I think there's a point where that lowest price becomes outweighed by somebody saying, do you know what? It's 20 quid more for EasyJet, but I've not had a cancellation with them yet. And there's a better chance I'm going to get to my destination. Now, where that split comes is really interesting. And that's where the relative attractiveness metric comes into play, because what we're doing in kind of, not just in my business, but it's nice to talk about this as a theory, because actually anybody can apply it. You can sit with the back of an envelope. Anybody listening can say, okay, friction reward, I'm interested. Be lovely if we ended up having a conversation, but actually get yourself the back of an envelope, write down the 5 biggest things get in the way of your customers. Then write down the 5 things that most customers get from having shopped with you or transacted with you. And then look at each one of those, and just for the fun of it, give each one a score out of 10. And then do the same thing for your 2 closest rivals. Do it honestly. And add up the frictions, add up the rewards, and take from the total reward score, the total friction score, and see what you're left with. You might be left with a positive score for you, but if your rival's score is higher, they are relatively more attractive than you. And that's the key. The relative attractiveness metric, I mentioned height earlier on. It's a really good analogy. A lot of organizations, particularly retailers, I don't know why, but lots of organizations are like this. We measure our progress versus ourselves. And if you imagine when you're a kid, your mum lining you up against the door, the line, the door jamb, and she puts a book or a hand on top of your head and draws a line. She goes, oh, Adrian, aren't you good? Look, you've grown an inch. Well done. Oh, you're tall. You're becoming a lovely, smashing young man. And then the year after, you're taller again. This is extraordinary, this progression. And we celebrate that as a victory. And we do that in our analytics all the time. We say, look, our NPS is 60. But last month, it was 59. So we've improved by 1. The fuck does that mean? By 1 what? How is that of any use to you? Well, people
other than self-gratification.
Yeah. So then you say, okay, that kind of measuring yourself on the door jamb, turn the question around a little bit, and you ask anybody, say, look, are you tall? And everybody's got an answer to that. And people will say tall or small or average. I'm average height for a male in the UK, and so I'd say average. And then you say, how do you know that? And people will look at you funny and they go, well, because I've seen other people. I've been on the street. I know. Exactly. You've used a comparative data set to establish your position in a continuum. And yet you don't do that for the performance of your CX. You don't do that for a lot of measures within your business. And tall is good, short is good, average is good. But if it's CX attractiveness, if you're improving your CX attractiveness, but you're miles behind somebody else, it's not a victory. It's not a success. There's another flip side way of looking at relative attractiveness, which is I'm a big lad for those not watching. I'm a big lad, and I could probably walk a marathon in 3 days. Probably walk it in 3 days. If I trained my face off, I could probably do it in 2. If I really worked hard, if I transformed my life, maybe I could do it in 5 hours, which becomes, that's a respectable time for a marathon. I'm just looking out the window here at one of my colleagues, one of my uncrowders, and she did the marathon this year in 4 hours and 15 minutes. So, even that 5 hours, I would be chuffed to bits with myself. My family would be proud of me. but Mo Farah is still going to come steaming past me and make my time look soppy. Well, if we are a big retailer, we cannot afford to sit there and go, oh, aren't we proud of ourselves? We're a little bit quicker today. Isn't that lovely? If everybody else is faster.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's fascinating, because it feels like, so I remember years and years ago working for a big corporate and doing a lot of work on competitive intelligence.
Yeah.
And it feels like, you know, what you're doing, because as you rightly say, it's like the analytics space. Yeah, there's a space for navel gazing, particularly around your own performance and how you can improve around that. But yes, we exist in the world. And
the big hurdle, Adrian, is, to be fair to people, the big hurdle is in the past, it's been very difficult to get the same data points from your competitors as you get from yourself. So you do that competitive analytics and you can make judgments about what you see openly.
Yeah.
And that's useful. It's a really worthwhile thing to do, and people should always do that. But getting down to the granularity of properly granularly actionable data that tells you whether the combination of things in their business is more attractive than your combination of things or not. That's the bit that nobody had cracked before. And that's why we ended up becoming a business, because our process, our methodology, which I give away in the book, Friction versus Reward.
Yeah.
Because I think it's more useful than just us.
And so that's one of the things I wanted to ask about, was like, because you've got that, so it's like, yeah, competitive intelligence, all very well and kind of good, but it relies on data, right? And you have access to your own data, you can build all that sort of stuff, but then you're looking for those comparative kind of like points. And I guess my question was going to be, so how are you kind of doing that? Are you just building all that data kind of, you know, your kind of self, and then you end up with this, you come to yourself and then it's like, ta-da.
Yeah, we've become a bit like a GfK for experience data. So, for example, in the UK, we have the most comprehensive set of data on the mainstream apparel market.
Right.
Right down to, we've accidentally done the largest sizing survey in the UK in 30 years. We didn't mean to. It's just part of our data capture process. And our data capture is all covert. And even our researchers, our quants, don't know who they're working for. And they go and make tiny little observations. They never ask for their opinion. It's not gathering a view or feedback. We break it down into hundreds of tiny little moments of observation. And it's really straightforward. It's not, was this good or was this bad? It's not subjective. It is, did this thing exist? If it existed, in what forms did it exist? And in those forms, how much or how little of it was there? And if you get that small enough and granular enough, you can build up very complex, elegant pictures from it. But you can do that in, you know, if you're looking at mainstream apparel, you can do that in Next, H&M, you can do it in Marks & Spencer's, you can do it in ASOS, you can do it in Primark, you can do it wherever you want to do it. And that's something we've done in a number of market sectors now. I mean, we have a lovely thing that we often end up saying to people we're talking to retailers we're talking to, we're already in your stores. We already know you. Yeah, we already know you, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Right. And so how does that work in relationship when you're speaking to people? And how does that work in relation to, we talked about NPS and CSAT and go like, you know, it's improved, like, yeah, so what? I mean, when people get to that kind of point and they're like going, they become, I feel like, unsatisfied with their current analytical package and going, well, I've just been signed up to the, you know, the church of NPS, let's say.
Yeah.
And I've decided that I'm unsatisfied with that anymore, pardon the pun, and I want to do something different. Does that mean you end up completely displacing all of that sort of stuff, and they kind of people switch, or do they working they complement each other? We've had
a couple of customers who've immediately gone, brilliant, I can drop all my voice to the customer, I can drop all it. And we go, no. This is complementary in lots of ways. Get rid of NPS eventually. But actually, you probably find that NPS is a useful tool to be able to rally people within the business. It's quite an easy number to be able to report to the city. Actually, it's probably better to be smarter about it and say, if I really want to shift the needle on NPS because the number means something, well, adding causality to that would be really useful. But there's also the voice of the customer piece. See, customers have to know that they can talk to you.
Mm-hmm.
The error that's been made in customer analytics, and it's a $20.8 billion error globally, is to then say, I'm now going to base all of my investment decision-making, my transformation, my strategic decision-making, my operational compliance on feedback from mostly my own customers, because it's very difficult to get proper feedback from people who aren't your own customers, mostly from subsets who are self-selecting, who are the people who will answer a feedback form, mostly from customers who are unhappy, because we know that human nature is to complain more than it is to praise, and mostly, in fact, almost entirely from human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem with human beings is our memory is contextual.
Mm-hmm.
So our recall of an experience changes according to the context in which we're recalling it. And you think about that in your own life, if you're skeptical about it, when you tell a story in the pub with some close friends, you tell a different story than the same story or the same incident when you tell it to a colleague in a board meeting,
mm-hmm.
or when you write it down, or when you think about it on holiday, or when you tell your prospective new partner, or when you tell your ex-partner, or whatever it might be, or when you tell your kids, or 10 years later. Mm-hmm. It's contextual to the circumstance in which you tell it. The second thing is that we have this tendency as human beings to want to please. So if somebody asks you a question, we try to answer it, whether we know or not. And so we construct what feels truthful to us, but turns out to be nonsense. There's a really interesting way of testing this if anybody wants to have a go at this. Next time you get asked to do an NPS survey, do it. Go through it and screenshot it at each stage. Your choices, particularly your verbatims, which get mined for sentiment. Tuck it away. The following week, look at it again. Decide if you'd have given the same answers. Chances are you'll already be saying no. But then also, before you go through it, just write down what is it you really liked about that experience? What makes you go and shop with or interact with that provider? 99 times out of 100, when you then open the survey, totally different reasons, totally different set of experiences. And the thing is, nobody's deliberately lying, but most people are accidentally not recalling the real motivations and the real truth. And what that means is you have a data set that has lies in it,
mm-hmm.
and you don't know which. So the entire data set is junk.
Well, I think the other thing it reminded me of as well when you were talking just then, I remember, so there's a guy, you'll know, Richard Shotton, who wrote Choice Factory.
Yeah, lovely.
And so I had Richard on the podcast a while ago on the back of the book. He told me a story about how it's related to the old.
It was a great episode, that one. I heard it. It was terrific.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Was it the old Ogilvy saying? Kind of people will and people like lie about stuff, and they don't intentionally know that they're lying. And he did this he recalled this retail example, and it was like to do with sales of wine.
Yeah.
And there was there's an aisle where it's like going, and customers there, when they played French music in the background, sales of French wine went up. When they played German music, kind of sales of German wine kind of went up. But then if you ask the customers about why they brought the French wine, or whether they're influenced by the music, they'll be like, no, not at all. I was looking for French wine. And similarly about the consumers, like people don't necessarily completely understand. Back to your kind of Kahneman and Tversky's kind of like type 1 and type 2 kind of like thinking is about kind of like what they do and why they do it and how they feel about kind of like stuff.
Yeah.
And so I love that kind of like story, because it's just like, it's that sort of thing. It's like, as you say, it's like, it's partial. It's not representative. It's not possibly, it's probably greatly inaccurate.
Yeah.
And then you ask yourself, if you accept all of that, are you willing to bet the house on it?
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing people do. Now, there's a complex bit of there's a simple bit of psychology behind that, which is a lot of the time we work with insight people, although mostly we're brought in by the CIO or the CMO or the operations leader. And that often comes from a frustration with existing tool sets. But actually, when you talk to insight people, and insight people are some of my favorite people in retail because they really are close to the mechanisms and the mechanics of the reality of their businesses. A lot of them are very frustrated. A lot of them will say, do you know what? My life is mostly being asked to fit some facts to a hypothesis that a senior leader in the business has already decided on a course of action that they're going to do anyway. And the reason for that is because if I'm the sales director and I've thrown £10 million behind reducing queuing times and it's made no difference to my revenue, if I've just done that because I felt like doing it, I was on a hunch, I get fired. If I've done that because I went to the insight team and said, give me something that proves out that queues are frustrating, well, they'll come back with a shit ton of VOC that tells me, oh, if only your queues are worse than other people's queues. And in that case, you get a chance to shrug to the rest of the board and go, yeah, so it was in the data. Turns out customers more complicated than that. We had an awesome example yesterday, and I can't say who the retailer is, but we were chatting to a couple of members of the board there who were talking about the way NPS is practiced in their business. And there's kind of a keeper of the customer experience there who will come to the board monthly and say, right, here's what's happened to our NPS. Here's why. Here's what's behind that. And that person will say, oh, it's because we've had a delivery issue with small product in the Northwest region, and that's been big enough to, okay, interesting. And they came to the board at the back end of last year and said, now, okay, our NPS has dropped 2 points because there is this particular technical thing which is happening with these 3 product categories. I can't say any more than that because it gives away who they are.
Sure.
There's this technical thing that's happening with these 3 product categories. And that's why in the last 3 months, our NPS has suffered. We need to fix this. It turned out these technical problems had been there for 13 years. But if you make a convincing case, if you link 2 things, if you correlate 2 things and call them causality, people will believe you because it feels scientific. It feels like you've added A and B and come up with C.
But that causes all sorts of kind of problems where you kind of talk about this kind of this idea that we have to be data-driven decision-making machines. And you're like going, depends on which way you approach that. If you approach it this way, you're like, no, we're going to look for the answer in the data to support everything that we're going to be data-driven. Yeah. Or you come out the other way where you let the data go. So you're going to be really careful about how you approach this, this sort of stuff.
It's interesting to think about, Adrian, as well, though, that from a selling point of view, I wouldn't set ourselves up in this way if I was just convinced, if I was only concerned with sales growth, because our data is neutral. It just tells the truth. And that at times is actually really challenging because you can't build a bullshit narrative around it. Bullshit narratives are great because you can sell a bullshit narrative because we love stories. You can say the reason that this needle is moved is because of that, because a butterfly flapped its wings in Leith and that had an effect down the motorway and it was eventually felt in. That's lovely, but we can't. Our data just says this is, this isn't, that exists, that doesn't. You're here, they're there. That's the issue to tackle, and that's. That purity, that honesty of data is, I never expected that to be an issue. And whenever we're tempted to kind of weave these narrative myths around the data, we have to pull ourselves back and say, do you know what? Some of the biggest benefits our customers have had is when they've just looked at something and gone, I never, look at that fact, that reality. I never knew that was happening in our business. Or I knew we were doing that, but I thought everybody did. Or I couldn't imagine before, unless I saw it on the page like that, that's the thing that drives that particular customer story. That neutrality of data is challenging to us because even when you look at things like mystery shop, for example. So mystery shop is I've got all sorts of opinions which we haven't got time for today on mystery shop, but mystery shop is often used as a compliance tool. So somebody goes in, acts out a scenario, goes through a process, answers 20 questions, 30 questions. And I promise you, most of the time, the answers to those questions are kind of filed away. But at the annual conference every year, a bunch of the verbatims or the filmed verbatims are shown to the audience and get people excited. Or at the board every month, there's a report that has X and 4 and 3 and Z and graphs and lovely things on it. But the 3 quotes it has, Mrs. Miggins says she really liked the pizzas. We go, oh, good, isn't it? Mrs. Miggins, that's fantastic, isn't it? She's happy. And you know, we tell ourselves we're data-driven. We're story-driven. We're narrative-driven.
Absolutely. So, I mean, it also strikes me that that there's probably some occasions where you've produced this honest view, this neutrality of data, that somebody's turned around and went, I don't accept that. Get out.
Yeah, and that's one of the nice things is that we actually deliver our data on 3 levels. We have what we call our showbiz level, which is where you just ask our platform a question and it gives you some answers. You do it in natural language, straightforward. You know, where's my biggest growth opportunity? Boom, bing, bing, bing. It's here, here, and here. Then there's the reporting you recognise is, you know, this is the report you'd give to the exec. This is a report you'd give to the director of. This is a report. And then we also deliver, with all that, a full analytics platform for the person who says, that's just bullshit. They get a chance to go in and go, I'm looking at this. And they go to the top number and go, well, yeah, it's all very well saying it there. It won't be supported by the signals. Oh, okay, it is supported by the signals, but it won't be supported in the observation. Oh, shit, it's in the observation data. And but again, we do it neutrally. We say, look, this is not us trying to give you a commentary to go with an agency report. This is truth that you've paid for access for, and it's just there or it isn't. And there is a really good example of that, a practical example, where what you often find is we're a tribal animal, and retail businesses are as tribal as we are. So you'll have factions within any retailer. And that's okay. That's just human. That's one of those things. You'll never eradicate that. There's no point trying. But what you can do is you can become the UN in those situations. You can become the United Nations that say, here is the truth. We have no angle on it. You have angles on it. The data doesn't have an angle on it. And an example of that, we discovered for one particular retailer in their e-com that they'd done this thing where they'd taken the returns card out of their delivery boxes. And they'd done it for the right reasons. They said, look, that's paper which times hundreds of thousands of transactions is a waste. It's not sustainable. Let's move that onto the app. Perfectly reasonable kind of thinking, very pragmatic. Well, there was a tribe within that business who went, customers must hate that. It's going to be confusing. How do they know how to return something? And there was a tribe that was saying, but it's a sustainable thing. And our customers love sustainability. That it's really important to them. And we just gave them the facts, which were that most other their rivals weren't taking out the returns card. And that, yes, they didn't score as well on their returns mechanism as their rivals. It was holding back their relative attractiveness. They were relatively less attractive at that stage of the journey. And that just gave them the fact. And what's actually happened as a result is lovely. It's a bit like a peace agreement where everybody now recognizes you've got to have that written communication. But the sustainable team have said, you know what, we can print it on existing packaging within the box. We can put it on the liner. We can do it there instead. So that reduces the waste. It's a little bit of or use a Sawyer ink, and it's, you know, and you kind of, you stand back and go, our work here is done, and then you fly through the window.
No, but I love the idea that, as you say, it puts up this kind of truth, but then it creates that in that example. It's like, here's the bounded reality.
Yeah.
And you have to innovate within that. And it forces people to come up with creative solutions to kind of like real kind of challenges. But I wanted to, you know, and I think that's great. But I also wanted to ask you, I know you can't really mention kind of many of the kind of the brands that you can work for, because right now, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a bit of, you're for many brands, you're a bit of a secret weapon.
Do you know, we actually offer an 8% rebate on our fees if they'll allow us, any of our customers will allow us to use their logo and their name in public facing case studies. And almost none of them have allowed us to do that so far, because they said we don't want people to know that we know the truth. So it costs them 8% more to work with us to keep it secret, which I love.
Well, it's great, but I mean, maybe kind of then I should ask a different question is rather than share some examples of how brands you work with are using RA to get ahead, is like, do you have some stories that you could tell us that would illustrate a bit of some brand examples, obviously kind of sanitize and anodize as much as possible?
Yeah, and we get used for a number of things that savings are always very compelling. And one of the things that our data pitches out is it shows you where you're so far ahead of everybody else that actually you can cut back in that area. You can reduce your investment level in that area. And we've seen that in a couple of times where a retailer has said, look, we're famous for X. And our data has said, well, you can still be famous for X, but you can actually spend 30% less on X and still be famous for X and maybe become famous for Y as well. But it's right from strategic. There was one particular retailer who, through lots of acquisitions, has ended up with some tiny footprint stores that didn't really match the rest of their market. And we were able to show them, again, through the data, that they could safely convert those stores into last mile delivery hubs. So they could shut off 50% of the floor space and hold local stock there. And instead have the other half as a very high reward kind of event type space. And there was again, I can't say too much because it ends up revealing who the companies are, but they're involved in cool brands, cool things. But they have to look after the brands that supply them. And they, through that, are now able to do something those brands can't do in terms of local interaction at street level with communities that are important to those brands. Conventionally, that looked like a really difficult thing to do because it was a straightforward way of saying, these 80 stores, if we convert these 80 stores for something slightly different from their usual revenue generation, what damage is that going to do to us? And our data was able to show, actually, you will take slightly less money, but you'll increase the online sales in those areas for your business because of the way that you improve that interaction with the communities you serve. Now, that's quite an extreme strategic example. But we've gone the other way as well with other brands where we had one particular one that was trying to build their click and collect service, as everybody has done, and weren't getting the traction they thought they should get. And they looked through our data, and it showed them that whilst their process was perfectly sensible, it just didn't cut through in either the physical or the online space. The online space was a bit easier to correct. So that was just about getting the comms right in terms of where that fit within the sales journey, within the customer journey. But in the physical space, they looked at the data set, and the data set showed them that one particular rival, a smaller rival, had a much higher score for that part of the click and collect process. So they went and had a look. They went and looked at what that rival was doing. And the moment they tell me that they walked in, they looked at it and went, oh, of course. That's exactly what we should be doing. And then they were able to apply that to that. And it did make a huge difference. Participation in click and collect went up dramatically. Well, you could say, well, good retailers, we're always in our rival stores. We're always in. Yes, we are. I was one of those people. I've been a retailer since I was 15. But you don't know what you're looking for. If you don't know what you're looking for, you don't see it.
Yeah, no, indeed. That's completely that's completely fair. But you call yourself a retailer, Richard. I mean, this seems like it doesn't feel just retail only.
No, it's not.
I mean, do you have plans? I mean, obviously, you kind of like dominate the retail space, obviously, because that's your first love and your kind of heartland. But plans, have you already kind of started venturing out, or is there plans to kind of venture out?
For kind of decent business sense, you look at the vertical you're in, that you have the most applicable expertise you have within the team, and you rinse that, frankly. And I love retail. I want to keep close to it as much as possible. But as we grow, we tell investors what our plans are. We talk to the market. We'll do financial services and insurance next, because that's very straightforward to create those comparison sets. The US will become a bigger and bigger market for us. We're already there, but that's going to be where a lot of our future lies. So we'll do healthcare provision, for example. That's again another straightforward one to be able to make that observational analysis on. Automotive, there's all sorts, quick serve restaurants, hospitality. We're already serving a number of brands, and those brands look at things in interesting ways. So they'll look at not their customer experience, but the customer experience in which their brands are encountered.
Right.
And that you can add a little layer there where it says, okay, if my brand, I don't know, my brand's called Blue and their brand's called Red. So I want to know the Blue experience at Tesco's, but I also now want to see the Red experience at Tesco's. I want to see them compared with each other so I can work out if there's any opportunities for me to take advantage. And I can also go to Tesco's as Blue and tell Tesco's, hey, you know, for free, we've learned these things about your customer experience that you might not know. And we've also looked at Waitrose and Sainsbury's and Aldi. Aren't we a lovely supplier to you? Aren't we worth more to you than Red are, who just turn up with cases and discounts? That is particularly useful if you are, say, an FMCG kind of customer that is relying on retailers for distribution and so on and so forth. Yeah, totally. And you also, the other fun about that is where we do that, we generally also include that brand's D2C channels. And that can often be quite a choker because you can see big challenges often in those D2C channels. The nice thing is you can see big challenges that are solvable. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it can often set up big questions.
Awesome. So Richard, I know that you're a busy guy and you've got some kind of songs coming up. So we'll speed through the kind of next bit. But anything else that we've kind of that you'd like to add or highlight before we kind of move on? I'll zoom out and ask you a couple of additional questions.
Yeah, just to go back to that thing of, it's lovely to be invited on to your podcast, Adrian. I really enjoy our conversations, and I'm really aware that people who listen to these sessions...
Can I make a note and interrupt you and make a note? Because I'll tell you what I'm going to do, because this is going to come out on the 24th of January, 2023. And I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do, Richard. I'm going to make this the 12th anniversary episode.
Nice. Yeah, fantastic. That'd be amazing. Thank you. Well, that puts more pressure on for what I was going to say, which was... I want to make sure that if you've been kind enough to listen to me and Adrian chatting, that you go away with something as a listener, beyond the kind of home truths, and that really is that envelope exercise I talked about. I by all means grab a copy of my book Friction Reward to work out how to do it, but frankly, you can do it just from the description here. Do it on your business, do it on your relationship with your customers. Think about your key customer stories. What are the customer stories that you want to dominate, that you really want to be great at? And look at everything you put in the customer's way and everything you give the customer back, and give yourself a score. Do that after this podcast. Just do it for yourself. Do it for your two closest rivals. And I promise you'll by the end of kind of next week, you'll be sitting there fizzing with ideas for things you hadn't thought of before.
Awesome. So Richard, what I was going to do, because that's great. I think that's the best advice for somebody who can think about wants to improve their customer experience. Is just literally take that piece of paper, envelope, whatever you kind of call it, and do that. But what I wanted to say is that quickly was to ask you, going the last couple of years, challenging, weird, transformative, different, still changing. Who knows? But what have you learned in the last kind of couple of years that you think this is going to help us, or this is and it's changed the way that we do kind of business, and will inform kind of what we're going to do kind of going forward?
There's a really big one, and it's one of those nice opportunities where you get a chance to go, yeah, I told you so. Not to you, Adrian, but to the world in general. Things never change as dramatically as people say they're going to change. Mm-hmm. We have broadly reverted to the mean as a species broadly post-pandemic. I'm sitting in a building at the minute. I'm sitting in our lovely offices in Camden, and we got this. My landlord's probably listening, but we moved in 8 months ago, and we won't even start paying the rent until March. Mm-hmm. Because the market, even at the beginning of last year, said, oh my God, nobody's going to want offices. It's all going to be remote. It's all going to be, a year later, we could sublet this for twice what it's costing us. And that's the truth of it. We're so short-term in our reactions to changes, but nothing changes as dramatically and as fast as you think it will do. Yeah. Now, applying that to the way you run your businesses is really important. You've got to try and think as much about the future as you can. The other thing, though, I think that I've learned since we last spoke 3 years ago is you really do have to listen to other people. Other people really do often know the answers to the questions you're asking. don't try and pretend that you're a special little snowflake, because we're not. And that's bitten me in the arse a couple of times in the last couple of years, where we've made decisions thinking we could buck the trend, and of course we couldn't. We got it wrong, and you've had to go and correct, or we've had to go and correct those mistakes. When actually, if we look back at it, there were plenty of people right at the beginning saying, "Well, if you're sure, but you do know that this is what most people would do in this situation." So it's one of those things that you've got to make mistakes. You've got to do stuff to make mistakes. You've got to make mistakes to learn. It hurts your heart when you make mistakes, but it's then how you deal with them and what you do to learn from them that I think that makes the crucial difference. And that it feels like we've been doing that really well, making mistakes, but understanding how to do better as a result.
Awesome. So a couple of things just to kind of wrap up. So thank you for that, because I think that's great. I mean, it shows that sometimes when we're kind of faced with kind of big challenges and crises, we have a tendency to get kind of to get obsessed by our own histrionics.
Yeah.
So first thing, I've been asking everybody since I've been published initially the Punk CX book, and then the Punk's XL book, which you big hands kind of were a contributor to. So thank you for that. 2 questions. Can't remember if I did this kind of 3 years ago on the last one, but I've been asking people for a series of words that they would associate, or a word or two they would associate with a punk approach to CX. Now, no pressure, but I have a list of 170 different words as I attempt to prove, or phrases, that this is a broad church. So, Richard, gauntlet thrown down. What 1 or 2 words would you use to describe a more punk approach to CX?
Your dad was wrong about customer analytics.
That's not 1 or 2 words.
So, junk the past.
I love it. I will keep that. Junk the past. That's so punk. Thank you. And then also, the second question was what company brand do you think is you contributed to the Punk XL? And it's that, that idea about playing sort of a bigger, more systemic, integrated, holistic kind of game. What company brand do you think is an experienced leader, and why?
Indies. It's really, that's where some of the best experience is now. And
Independence.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's flowing against the grain. We're just starting to see a recovery in independence again. Independent bookshops are emerging, independent butchers, independent clothes businesses. And there's a confidence that's come again. I think there are some great schemes for it. Oxford, where I live, for example, have put a lot of effort into putting independent new businesses into physical retail spaces with some help and support for a period of time. And it's causing you used to live in Brighton, so you saw this very closely in that marketplace. But we're starting to see it, Brighton stood out because it was a home of independence. We're starting to see that happen elsewhere as well now. You've got lovely Graham Salt talking about the resurrection of some of those streets in Durham. Moving from the identikit chocolate box cut out and drop, which my business is part of helping improve.
Yeah.
But actually it's the indies that are providing the real kind of challenge to the status quo and making people want to go to the shops again.
Nice. Yeah, I like it. Big shout out to the independent stores. And we were in Brighton kind of last weekend, and actually just walking through the North Lanes, which is the hub of old school indie kind of like narrow kind of lanes and rickety shops in many respects. But sometimes some of the things that people are doing there are super cool. So
I remember there was a gun shop next to a fudge shop at one point. And you're like, fair enough.
Yeah, exactly.
Deactivated antique guns, I should say, to any reader that's thinking, Brits can go and buy guns? But I thought they were communist socialists. We are, very proudly.
So one final thing that I've been adding on to the end of these kind of podcasts, because I've been trying to focus on more kind of and find more kind of good news stories, because it's like doom scrolling kind of right now. Unless you're a Brighton and Hove Albion supporter like I am, and we're on the up right now and sort of doing quite well. And we've got a World Cup winner in our squad right now with Alexis McAllister. So tell me, what's the most interesting, positive, or exciting thing you've seen in the last week?
Last week, that's a real good question. It's not the right answer, but we're flying to a bunch of the team to the US on Friday, and we've seen awful bloody experiences with 3 different airlines. In that's made me want to shake up the entire industry. It's not just about price in that category anymore, not within a bracket.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of other stuff that we need to make our trip successful. I want people to think about that. But in terms of something in the last week that's made me go, that's fantastic. It was actually, it was a company that popped up on one of my social feeds, where I ended up buying an extra Christmas present for my partner because it was something I wish I'd seen in November.
Right.
And it was a handicraft thing, but done in such a high branded quality. So there's lots of handicraft stuff out there. This is basically air drying clay and some lovely paints and varnishes in really interesting contemporary colours that you could make a lamp with. And so there's the lamp fitting there, and it appears to be safe and all that kind of stuff. But what was great about it was it didn't do it in a kind of like, oh, here's pottery and that's a lovely. It was kind of, here's a modern lovely thing to do to connect you with your fingertips and the maker art. And it was so lovely. And I was so pleased that after buying it, the packaging, perfect. The whole experience of giving it was just glorious. And the brand called Sculpted. And massive shout out to them. I really wish them massive success because it was just pinpoint every single part of the experience.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I was definitely going to check that out. But so, Richard, I will let you go. But before you do that, I want to just say congratulations on the success so far. I know that I was a very player. I contributed a little bit to the kind of the friends and family kind of around. So that's a bit of a disclaimer on the end of this, is that I am connected to Uncrowd in a small way. So I get kind of kept up abreast of some of the developments. But thank you for sharing your time and your experience with us today and your insights. And congratulations on your success today, and keep smashing it, my friend.
Thanks, man. Massively enjoyed it. And thanks for asking us on again, Adrian. It's always good to talk.
Yeah, no, because I just kind of say, it's like one of the things I've been kind of doing as well, just kind of like lately, is that because I've been speaking to people, I've been around, this podcast has been around for a while. I've been trying to kind of revisit some of the people that I've spoken to in the past that were on their special kind of on their kind of journey. And you mentioned it right at the top of the of our chat. We talk about how people have been fighting against the market, as it were.
Yeah.
And it's like sometimes you've got to stay true and hold your position, and then hopefully the arc of time and the arc of the market bends towards you. Well, it's like there was I had a conversation with the folks at Cogito, a guy called Josh Feast at Cogito.
Yeah.
And I spoke to them about 4 or 5 years ago. And the market has come around to them. They were doing real-time guidance, like back when it wasn't really a thing.
Yeah.
And the market has just kind of come back to them where they've just had a 30,000 seat install, kind of like, which has just gone scale. We've done it, right? So it's like we're fit for everything, for anything and everything. And so, but it takes guts, it takes bottle, it takes grit and determination to hold fast, to wait for the market to come to you.
Yeah,
and so I tip my hat to you, kind of like, for plowing your furrow, and please stay the course, because the market will come to you.
We absolutely will do it. It very much has happened recently. Now that there's a downturn, people are looking at it and going, oh, my customer satisfaction numbers are the same as they were before. People are still just as happy, but they're giving me less money. Well, we know why.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. On that note,
cheers.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Adrian.
Speak soon. Wow, what a great interview. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. Find out more about me and the work that I do at adrianswinscoe.com. Do leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you have any comments, feedback, or questions about the podcast, then feel free to send me a message to podcast@adrianswinscoe.com. And do tune in again. Thanks very much.